Aisha perched on the living room couch, gazing at the framed wedding photo of herself and Zayd. 5 years ago, they had seemed blissfully happy. So much had changed. Each night, she waited for him to come home, holding on to faint hope that his key, turning in the lock, would spark real warmth. When he finally appeared, his greetings were sparse, a curt nod or a weary grunt. She cooked elaborate meals that went untouched. She decorated their living space with fresh flowers he never seemed to notice. The silence between them grew as thick as the walls, and it tormented her to guess what he was truly thinking. Late one evening, while tidying the hallway, she heard him talking on the phone in hushed tones. "I can't do this anymore." Her breath caught, heart racing as she pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear more. Who was on the other end? What did he mean by this? After that, his behavior became even more distant. She tried to ask if something was wrong, but he deflected every question. With each passing day, a dark pit of anxiety formed inside her, warning that something in their marriage was fundamentally broken. The morning of their 5th anniversary, Aisha woke early, determined to salvage whatever remained of their relationship. She prepared Zayd's favorite dish, a spiced lamb stew and baked fresh bread. She set out her preferred mint tea in a porcelain pot, trying to recall the days when they would chat happily over breakfast. By 7 that evening, the table was elegantly arranged with rose petals and tall candles. She wore the blue dress he once complimented her on. Every detail felt deliberate, an attempt to remind him of why they had chosen each other. Yet as the hours dragged on with no call or text, her excitement dissolved into dread. When Zayd finally walked in at nearly midnight, he looked surprised to find her waiting. He hesitated in the doorway, the scent of floral perfume, one Aisha never wore, lingering around him. She stood, unsure whether to confront him about that aroma or his tardiness first. "Did you forget what day it is?" she asked, voice tense. He set his keys on the counter, averting his gaze. "I lost track of time." She gestured at the untouched meal, candles flickering low. No text, no call. This was supposed to be special. He sighed, slipping past her. "I'm tired. Let's not argue." Unable to sleep, Aisha lay awake, replaying the events of their anniversary disaster. She heard Zayd shifting beside her. Then he muttered a name in his sleep. Miriam. At first, she thought it was a random dream, until he spoke it again, this time with a note of regret. Her chest tightened. Who on earth was Miriam? She sat up, carefully placing a hand on his shoulder, but he remained lost in his dream. When dawn light filtered through the curtains, she mustered her courage to ask. "You kept saying Miriam last night," she began over a quiet breakfast, voice trembling with uncertainty. "Is she someone I should know about?" He stiffened, barely lifting his gaze from his coffee mug. "I don't remember any dream. Probably nothing." "But you sounded upset," she pressed, pulse pounding. "I can't ignore it. Please, Zayd." Irritation sparked in his eyes. "Just drop it. I can't control what I say in my sleep." She chewed her lip, nodding slowly, though her mind buzzed with suspicion. An unspoken barrier now loomed between them. Miriam's name clung to her thoughts all day, adding to the sense of foreboding that had been growing ever since she overheard his whispered phone call. Determined to uncover the truth, Aisha broke her usual rule against invading Zayd's privacy. Early one morning, while he was showering, she slipped into his study. The desk was cluttered with envelopes and paperwork. Carefully, she opened drawers, trying not to disturb the neat piles. A thin folder labeled Personal caught her eye. Inside, she found financial statements, but nothing suspicious. She was about to close the folder when a slip of paper fluttered to the floor. Picking it up, she read a short, handwritten note. "Zayd, I forgive you, even though my heart aches. I hope you'll tell her the truth. Miriam." Aisha's heart thundered. The handwriting was delicate, but the words carried emotional weight. Who was this woman urging Zayd to tell her the truth? Aisha's pulse raced with new questions. Had Zayd betrayed someone named Miriam, or had he been forgiven for some transgression? The shower shut off suddenly, water pipes clanking. Panicking, Aisha returned the note, careful to place it back where she found it. She darted out of the study, her mind whirling. Why did this woman talk of forgiveness? What truth was Zayd hiding? And most importantly, what did this mean for Aisha's already fragile marriage? That evening, Aisha confronted him before she lost her nerve. She laid the slip of paper on the kitchen table between them. "I found this," she said quietly, her voice wavering. "From someone named Miriam. She mentions forgiving you and telling me the truth." Zayd's eyes went wide, flicking from the note to her face. For an instant, he looked panicked. Then his expression hardened. He snatched the paper and began tearing it into pieces. Aisha gasped, reaching out too late. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, voice low. "In your study," she admitted, steadying herself. "I'm sorry I snooped, but you've been so distant. I needed answers." He glared, crushing the scraps in his fist. "You had no right. My past isn't your playground." Her frustration spiked. "We're married. If your past affects us now, I deserve to know." Zayd tossed the shredded note into the trash. "What matters is our present. This has nothing to do with you. Leave it alone." Silence engulfed them. Aisha's tears blurred the edges of her vision, but Zayd turned away, stomping off to the bedroom. She stared at the torn fragments, fear tangling with her anger. Miriam's message was gone, but the questions multiplied. Unable to confide in her family, Aisha sought advice from her close friend Farida. They met at a small cafe. Voices hushed as patrons around them chatted over steaming mugs. Aisha recounted every unsettling detail. The late-night phone call, the missed anniversary, the whispered name in his sleep, and now the letter from Miriam. Farida listened, eyes grave. Could Miriam be an ex? Farida asked. Maybe he can't let go. Aisha shook her head, recalling the note's tone of remorse and finality. It sounded more significant. She wrote about forgiveness, urging him to tell me something crucial. Farida leaned forward, speaking gently. "Whatever it is, you need the full story. Zayd might be hiding something that could destroy your marriage if it stays buried. Be careful, though. His reaction to you snooping suggests he doesn't want you digging deeper." Aisha sipped her coffee, hands trembling. "I'm terrified," the way he tore up the note, like he'd do anything to keep this secret. "But I can't keep ignoring the warning signs. I feel like I'm missing a piece of my own life." Farida reached out, squeezing her hand. "I'm here. Whatever happens, you won't face this alone." Emboldened by Farida's support, Aisha returned home that afternoon, heart pounding. She waited until Zayd left for a supposed business meeting. Slipping into his study again, she scoured each drawer carefully. One drawer was locked. She rummaged through his desk until she found a tiny key hidden in a pencil holder. The lock clicked open, revealing a stack of papers. Her eyes widened at the first item, an ornate wedding invitation emblazoned with the names Zayd and Miriam. The date was from 6 years ago. Confusion rippled through her. Zayd had never once mentioned a previous marriage. She lifted the invitation, noticing a glossy photo beneath it. The photo showed Zayd in a tux, smiling radiantly, arm around a woman with dark hair and a dazzling grin. A swirl of emotion hit Aisha, jealousy, betrayal, sadness. She couldn't parse them fast enough. If he'd been married before, why hide it so thoroughly? And how could it possibly connect to the letter and the mention of forgiveness? She replaced everything, mindful not to disturb the arrangement. Locking the drawer, she felt her stomach churn. The man she married had lived a life she knew nothing about, and the shadows of that life were creeping ever closer. That night, Aisha gathered her courage. Over a tense dinner of reheated leftovers, she finally spoke. "Zayd, I know you were married before. Why didn't you tell me about Miriam?" He froze, fork halfway to his mouth. The quiet clink of silverware on china marked the shift from calm to confrontation. "Where'd you get that idea?" he asked, voice tight. She swallowed, adrenaline coursing through her. "I found the wedding invitation in your study. There's a photo of you and Miriam. You looked happy." His eyes darkened. For a moment, she thought he might deny everything. Instead, he exhaled shakily. "She's gone," he said flatly, "and it's too painful to discuss." Aisha's heart clenched. "Gone how? Did she pass away?" His jaw worked, as though wrestling with emotion. She died. That's all you need to know. Tears pricked Aisha's eyes. Why hide such a massive part of your past from me? He set his fork down. I'm asking you to let it go. Miriam is dead. Our relationship ended in tragedy. Reliving it helps no one. Without waiting for her reply, he rose and left the room. Aisha stared after him, grief and suspicion roiling in equal measure. The revelation that Miriam was deceased raised more questions. Why had Zayd hidden his first marriage? And how exactly had Miriam died? Aisha couldn't ignore the contradictions. The letter's tone implied Miriam was around more recently, and that she believed Zayd owed Aisha some truth. Days later, while Zayd was at work, Aisha mustered her resolve again. She revisited his study, discovering a photo album beneath a stack of old magazines. Flipping through, she found snapshots of Zayd and Miriam vacationing. Beaches, candlelit dinners, sunsets. Their joyful expressions in earlier photos gave way to tense smiles in later ones. On the final page, a single picture fell out. The back contained a chilling message in scrawling handwriting. If I die, it won't be an accident. Miriam. The date was only a few months after their wedding. Aisha's heart lurched painfully. Could this truly mean Miriam anticipated harm? Replacing the photo, her mind reeled. If Miriam believed her life was in danger, how had she ended up dead? Was Zayd directly involved? The notion felt horrific. Yet she couldn't dismiss the mounting evidence. Holding the album tight, she realized she had crossed into a territory she never imagined, suspecting her husband might be capable of violence. The puzzle of dates gnawed at Aisha. Zayd claimed Miriam died years ago, but a photographic clue suggested a different timeline. Determined to confirm the basics, she visited the local records office. After searching birth and death indexes, she unearthed a brief obituary for Miriam, stating she died following a fall at a coastal resort. The official record placed Miriam's death at 6 years prior, yet the mention of her ominous message seemed more recent. Confusion fueled Aisha's anxiety. Seeking clarity, she located a cemetery listing. The headstone bore Miriam's name, but the death date was a mere 3 years ago. Kneeling at the grave, Aisha traced a cold stone with shaking fingers. How could there be a 3-year discrepancy? Had someone mislabeled the headstone? Or was the official record incomplete? The thought that Miriam might have been alive well into Aisha's marriage churned her stomach. She stood there for a long time, leaves rustling around her feet. The oppressive weight of the discovery left her breathless. If the 6-year record was false, then Zayd might have been hiding not just an old tragedy, but a more recent and possibly sinister secret. Returning to her car, she felt dread settle like a stone in her chest. That night, Aisha confronted Zayd, voice trembling. Why does Miriam's headstone say she died 3 years ago, but the records say 6? You keep insisting she's been gone a long time, but something doesn't add up. He dropped his keys on the kitchen counter, eyes dark with anger. Stay out of this, Aisha. The tombstone must be wrong. She stepped closer, frustration flaring. People don't typically engrave the wrong date of death. Are you saying her family got it wrong? He bristled, tension rippling through his shoulders. I don't know, and I don't care. Let her rest. Her heart pounded. I found a note from her, warning that if she died, it wouldn't be accidental. How can you act like I'm overreacting? He glared, stepping toward her with a menacing edge. You're crossing a line, he growled. Drop it, or we'll both regret it. Aisha's breath caught at the threat in his voice. She stood rooted, fear battling her desire for answers. Finally, with a scoff, he pushed past her, heading to the bedroom. She remained in the kitchen, tears burning her eyes. She was left with an agonizing certainty. Miriam's death was no simple accident, and Zayd was hiding more than she'd ever suspected. Despite the danger, Aisha refused to be cowed. She needed more evidence. Rummaging through a storage closet, she stumbled upon a dusty cardboard box. Inside lay letters and a slim journal. The first page was inscribed with looping script. Miriam's diary. Carefully, she read the entries. Early pages glowed with love for Zayd, describing how attentive and caring he was. But the tone shifted over time. Miriam detailed arguments, accusations, and Zayd's growing possessiveness. She wrote about feeling isolated, no longer allowed to meet her friends freely. Then came the mention of a pregnancy. Miriam seemed both thrilled and terrified, uncertain of Zayd's reaction. Near the end, one entry stated, "He says a child might not be his. I'm scared of his threats. I need to leave before it's too late." The final page ended abruptly. Aisha swallowed hard, tears forming. The diary confirmed that Miriam was in real fear of her life. If she indeed tried to flee, and then fell at a hotel, Aisha could no longer shrug off the possibility that Zayd had played a direct role. Closing the diary, she wiped her eyes, heart pounding. She resolved to honor Miriam's story by uncovering the whole harrowing truth. Distressed by the mention of a pregnancy, Aisha searched for hospital records, visiting the facility referenced in Miriam's diary. She convinced a clerk she was doing genealogical research. After a lengthy wait, the clerk located a file. Miriam was admitted here with severe injuries from a fall. The clerk explained. She delivered prematurely. The baby survived briefly in neonatal care, but the father refused responsibility. Aisha's blood ran cold. The father was listed as Zayd, who signed a statement denying paternity. The infant's records ended with the child being placed in foster care. Stunned, she thanked the clerk and retreated to her car. Her mind churned with disbelief. Zayd had essentially abandoned Miriam's baby, a newborn who might well have been his. If he was cold enough to discard that child, what else might he have done? She recalled the diary's final lines about escaping. Miriam must have tried to leave pregnant and ended up mortally injured. Accelerating home, Aisha wrestled with the heartbreak of it all. She pictured Miriam alone, afraid, forced to give birth under traumatic circumstances. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she wondered if Zayd had intentionally lied, or if he'd used the denial to protect himself from legal or criminal consequences. That evening, Aisha steeled herself to confront Zayd. She waited in the living room, the hospital file clutched in her hands. The moment he walked in, she held it out. "Care to explain this?" His face darkened as he skimmed the pages. "Where did you get these?" "I spoke to the hospital," she said, voice shaking. "Miriam gave birth, and you denied any responsibility for the baby. You walked away." He flung the papers aside, anger twisting his features. "That child wasn't mine. She tried to pin it on me." Aisha trembled, tears of both fear and fury burning her eyes. "Do you really expect me to believe Miriam fabricated everything? What about her diary entries? Your controlling behavior?" She was petrified. Zayd stepped forward, raising a hand. She flinched, heart pounding. He grabbed her wrist, squeezing painfully. "Stay out of my business," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "If you keep this up, you'll regret it." Wrenching free, she stumbled backward, tears spilling as her wrist throbbed. "You can't scare me into silence," she whispered, though her voice quavered. His cold glare sent ice through her veins, confirming the depths he might sink to in order to protect his secrets. Aisha fled the house that night, seeking refuge at Farida's apartment. Over cups of sweet tea, she recounted Zayd's threats, the baby, and the diary. Farida's eyes brimmed with concern. "You can't go back there alone," Farida insisted. "He's dangerous." Aisha buried her face in her hands. "I feel torn. Part of me loves who I thought he was, but I'm terrified of who he's become, or maybe always was." Farida rubbed her back gently. "From everything you found, it sounds like Miriam was desperate to escape. If Zayd cornered her, he might have caused her fall." Aisha nodded, tears slipping free. "I want to stop him from hurting anyone else. I need to tell the police, but without a confession, it's my word against his, and the case was likely closed as an accident." Farida tapped her phone thoughtfully. "What if we record him admitting something? If we catch a confession on tape, they'll have reason to reopen the investigation." Though frightened, Aisha felt a renewed spark of hope. "It's risky," she whispered, wiping her cheeks. Farida squeezed her hand. "We'll do it carefully. You won't be alone, and we'll get justice for Miriam. I promise." They formulated a plan. Aisha would convince Zayd she was rethinking everything and wanted to meet him on neutral ground. Farida, hidden, would record any incriminating statements. Nervous but resolute, Aisha dialed Zayd's number. He answered tensely. She forced a tremor into her voice. "Zayd, I'm sorry I ran off. I've been so confused. Could we talk, please?" He hesitated, then agreed to meet at Farida's place, believing Farida would be gone. Aisha carefully arranged the living room, ensuring a discreet vantage point for Farida's phone camera. When Zayd arrived, he looked wary and skittish, scanning the apartment. Aisha offered him a seat. Her voice kept low. "I want to understand," she began. "I found records about Miriam's baby, her diary. Please, help me see your side." He rubbed his temples. "You shouldn't have dug into that. She was unstable, always accusing me. The baby wasn't mine, but she insisted." Aisha swallowed, tears flooding her eyes. "Did you fight at the hotel? Is that how she fell?" His face contorted, torn between anger and guilt. "I never intended for her to die," he muttered. "She threatened to leave, and we argued. She lost her balance. I panicked." Farida, unseen, recorded every word, adrenaline surging. Relief mingled with horror as Aisha heard his partial confession. She pressed him further, voice shaking. "So you argued with Miriam on that balcony and she fell? Did you push her?" Zayd's eyes flickered with panic. He clenched his fists. "I only grabbed her arm to keep her from walking out on me. She fought back. Next thing I knew, she was gone, over the railing." Aisha's heartbeat thundered. This was the admission they needed. "You realize it's not an accident, right?" she whispered. "You forced her to stay and she ended up dead." He rose abruptly, staring at her with raw fury. "You don't understand. She was threatening to ruin me. I just wanted her to calm down. It wasn't murder." Footsteps sounded behind the door. Farida was about to reveal herself, phone in hand, but the floor creaked. Zayd's gaze darted that way. Realizing something was off, he lunged toward the hallway, shouting, "Who's there?" Aisha tried to block him, but he shoved her aside. Farida stepped out, phone trembling in her grasp. "Stay back," she warned. "We have everything on video." Zayd roared, his glare laced with betrayal. "How could you do this to me, Aisha?" Zayd grabbed Farida's phone, trying to snatch the device. Aisha scrambled up, intercepting him. They grappled in the narrow hallway as Farida backed away, clutching the phone protectively. Zayd's strength overwhelmed them. Aisha tasted blood where she bit her lip trying to hold him off. Shouts echoed from outside as neighbors, alarmed by the noise, knocked on the door. Zayd froze, panting, torn between fleeing and continuing his assault. Farida called for help, her voice high with panic. The front door burst open, two neighbors barging in. One demanded, "What's going on?" Zayd spun around, cursing under his breath. Seeing the neighbors and hearing sirens in the distance, he backed away. Fury etched into every line of his face. Moments later, uniformed officers rushed in. Farida handed over a phone, explaining the situation in hurried words. Miriam's suspicious death, the recorded confession, the violence. Aisha leaned against the wall, shaking from adrenaline and fear. Zayd tried to deny everything, insisting they'd trapped him. But when the officers replayed the footage, his own voice echoed damningly. They restrained his wrists, reading him his rights. Meeting Aisha's eyes, he spat, "You destroyed my life," as they led him away. She slumped, relief colliding with sorrow. In the following days, Aisha turned over every scrap of evidence to the authorities. Miriam's diary, the hospital records, the phone footage. She spoke to a sympathetic detective who promised a petition for the case to be reopened. The detective seemed particularly moved by the baby's fate and the contradiction between the official obituary and the headstone date. Word spread fast. Miriam's sister, whom Aisha eventually located through hospital contact details, thanked her tearfully. The sister had long suspected foul play, but the police never had sufficient evidence to question Zayd's claims. Now, with a recorded confession of his involvement, the authorities were forced to re-examine Miriam's tragic end. Aisha stayed at Farida's apartment while she arranged to move out of the home she once shared with Zayd. Packing her belongings was bittersweet. She found old photographs of happier times, feeling a pang of grief for the love she thought she had. But each memory was tarnished by the realization that it had hidden so much, and possibly killed to keep his secret safe. Nights brought nightmares of Zayd's rage, of Miriam's final moments. But a small flame of hope flickered too. They had honored Miriam's last words, ensuring her death would remain buried as an unchallenged accident. Several weeks later, Aisha stood at Miriam's grave, a bouquet of lilies in her hand. She placed them gently against the headstone, heart heavy with sympathy. She recalled the diary entries describing Zayd's early tenderness, and how swiftly that tenderness had turned to coercion and fear. Leaning forward, Aisha whispered, "You deserved a full life, and I'm sorry it ended the way it did. But your story won't be forgotten." Tears blurred her vision, a testament not only to Miriam's pain, but also to her own heartbreak. Behind her stood Farida, a steadfast presence. They had just come from a police station, where new charges were being pursued against Zayd for homicide. The detective had praised their courage in gathering evidence. While nothing could bring Miriam back, the possibility of justice brought a measure of solace. Aisha exhaled, contemplating her future. She had filed for divorce, closed joint accounts, and begun the long journey of rebuilding her life. In the quiet hush of the cemetery, she recognized that some wounds might never fully heal. Yet she refused to let fear overshadow the glimmer of freedom she now possessed. Stepping away from the grave, she clasped Farida's hand, determined to move forward and carry Miriam's memory toward a safer tomorrow. The end.